Welcome to this video on how to create ombres. So the first half of this video is a slideshow where I give you my top 9 tips and tricks to how to create a seamless ombre. And then I get into actually making and showing you. So there's a lot of information, and ombres take practice. Let's go over these tips and then we'll make soap, and if you have questions, just let me know. So my first tip is color choice. Color choice matters. You want colors that can complement each other and that flow together. Otherwise, it can be hard to get a pleasing ombre. If you're not sure where to start, picking from the rainbow is a really good place to begin. Red to orange, green to blue, blue to purple. Those colors flow together. They work together. They will create nice ombres. Now, that being said, you don't have to do that. I have done black to red. I have done brown to orange to yellow. So it really kind of just depends on the color scheme, and each color should be evaluated on its own. White is a very popular base color for ombres, and white can create some really pretty ombres, but can also be tricky. White definitely works better with some colors than it does other colors. Purple is a hard one to get to ombre with white. That's the color I chose in my example. So yeah, I challenged myself there, but it's just a tricky color. And so what I usually recommend when you are starting with your first ombres is to not use white. Use colors, but use the rainbow colors. Pick from those colors, but don't use white or black. Black actually works pretty well with a lot of colors, and I love making ombres with black. Black definitely works best with colors that you would normally add black to darken them up. So blues, greens, purples. I think those create the best results with black. But that being said, you can use black with other colors. Tip number 2 is your color ratio. So color separation is generally not equal. Now, again, we'll take this on a case-by-case basis, but generally, if I'm doing a 2-color ombre, I am not going to split it 50-50. It's not going to give you a good ombre. Generally, you'll get an ombre, but you're just not going to get as smooth or as nice an ombre. So I don't generally recommend splitting your colors 50-50 if you're just doing a 2-color ratio. When you get into multiple colors, it gets a little bit different. My rule of thumb for this is more of the lighter colors, less of the darker colors. Now again, this depends on the colors, but generally this is going to create a better ombre. So, for example, if I'm using white and green, I'm typically going to use 70% white and 30% green. If I'm using black and blue, I would use only 30% of black, because that's the darker color, and 70% of the blue. There's wiggle room with this. Sometimes I might use a 60-40 split, sometimes a 65-35 split. It again can depend on the colors, but in general, if you're starting and let's say you're going to do a green to blue ombre, I'd probably do a 60-40 split. 40 being the color you're starting with typically, and 60 the color you're going to be adding into the mold. And again, that take that with a grain of salt, because it really does depend on your color choice. If you are using white and black, I definitely usually stick with that 70-30 ratio. So just my tips, I would say try it out and see what you think. I have played with all sorts of different ratios, and ultimately my favorite comes down to that 70-30 split or 65-35 split. Fragrance is important. You need a fragrance that does not accelerate. I know this is probably common sense, but you really want to make sure you are working with a fragrance that does not accelerate. You need a lot of time because you have to pour lots and lots of passes. And so there are fragrances that they say behave, but they don't behave over a long period of time. And so you really want a fragrance that you know is going to give you today and tomorrow to work with, basically a long time, especially if you're new to this technique. Tip 4, most recipes will work. You don't necessarily need a special recipe. You should be able to use your standard recipe to make an ombre. Most typical recipes are comprised of a 60-40, 65-30, something like that, split of soft to hard oils. If your recipe falls within that kind of ratio, you should be fine to work with it. What's more important is the temperature you're working at. For me, working between 90 and 100 really does make a difference. And stick blending too, I get just barely a light trace. So if you have a recipe that's predominantly solid oils, then yeah, that's probably not going to work because they generally will set up faster. If you were doing something like a salt bar, obviously that type recipe is not going to work, but your typical recipe should work just fine. Tip 5, colors can accelerate your batch. Not all colors will do this, but there are definitely colors that can make your batch get thicker on you. Titanium dioxide is one of these. The key is not to overuse titanium dioxide. I have made plenty of ombres with white with no problem. It's when I overuse white that I tend to have this problem, and when I stick blend the white in, that you can have more of a problem. Too much mica can also cause your soap to get thicker or to accelerate. And I've also had that issue with activated charcoal. And generally it's when I use too much that you will have this issue. So if you start seeing that problem and you're using colors, maybe address how much color you're using, how you're mixing it in. Are you stick blending it? Or are you just mixing with oil and then stirring it in by hand? All of those things can play a factor in your batch accelerating or not accelerating. Tip 6, adding color varies. So can you pour what do I mean by this? First off, that means that when you are pouring soap into your mold, so you have your 2 cups of color, and you're pouring a little bit of color into 1 cup, mixing it in, and then you're pouring it in the mold. And then you're taking that second color, adding more in, mixing it, pouring it in the mold. And you're doing this over and over and over. And you will see a lot of people say everything should be equal. Add 3 tablespoons of color into it, do 2 passes. Add another 3 tablespoons, do 2 passes. Like, I'm just picking random numbers. And sometimes, yes, this can work and create a gorgeous ombre. But more often than not, imprecision, like it's not gonna hold true. So I have found, and I have been making ombres for years, that color and how much you add, like how much you are pouring into the mold, how much you are adding to the pot each time will vary, and it's a feel, and it's based on the colors that you are using that time. It's not always the same. Plus, you are going to be pouring more into your mold than what you just poured into your cup. If you pour equal amounts at the end, you will be left over with the same amount of soap that you started with in that cup. And you will, like, if you were to pour all of that in, you would not have the first half of your mold, your loaf would be an ombre, but the second half would be all one color. So you are always going to pour more soap into the mold than what you actually put into your cup. And how much you pour into the mold each time and how much you pour into that cup of color, they do not have to be equal. I will talk much more in depth about this when I'm actually making the soap, so you can see what I mean. But just remember, when you're adding color and when you're pouring that color into the mold, it does not have to be equal. And this is kind of a carryover of the previous. Pores are not equal. So pouring the color into your one color into the next color doesn't have to be equal each time. And how much you pour into the soap mold each time doesn't have to be equal. In fact, it should not be equal most of the time. So when you see me making these videos, I talk about feel a big chunk of the time. In ombres, there's just a good chunk of ombres that's about feel. And the more you make of them, the more you do, the more you work with colors, you get a feel for what works together, how it works together. And you will be able to then go, oh, I need to adjust this. I'm going to have not enough color, or I'm going to have too much color at the end. Let me pour a little bit more of this pass. The next couple passes, I'm going to do that. And guess what? When you do that, your ombre will still turn out okay. So yeah, I'll talk more about this when I'm making the soap, but pores are not equal, and that's okay. Tip 8, patience is required. Ombres take time. They take a lot of time to make compared to most batches, and they require a lot of pouring passes. A lot. If you want to get a nice seamless ombre, you have to do a lot of passes. There's no way to get around that. And what that means is you have to be patient. You don't rush the process. Also, don't give up on the process. Trust it. I generally recommend, if you're starting out with the first time making an ombre, start with like a 2 or 2.5 pound batch. Do a small batch. That's going to give you an easier way to get a feel for ombres. I never make them larger than 5 pounds because there's not enough time, and it gets much harder when you start scaling up beyond 5 pounds. And my last tip for you is trust the process. As you start pouring each pass, it sometimes feels like change isn't happening. And that's actually okay. If you see change, definitive change, then your ombre is probably not going to be very smooth. Like, you want that to see that change in color to just come about really gradually. Also, if things seem to be going wrong, don't panic. Like, just trust the process. Keep going with it. Stick with it. Because a lot of times, when you cut it, you will still have a really pretty soap. So those are my tips for you. Have fun with this process. I am going to make a 2-color and a 3-color ombre now, and I will do a lot of talking during the video. So I hopefully I didn't talk too much for you. But yeah, if you do ombres, let me know. If you have questions about them, let me know. I'm happy to help. And I hope you have fun with the process. Okay, so I've gone over all the tips I have for making a ombre. Now, what I am going to do is make a 2-color ombre right now, and I'm doing purple and white. I'm going to go from white to purple. Normally I would go from the darker color to the lighter color, but I have an embed, and I don't know if you can see, it's a skate. With embeds, I don't want to mess up my whole ombre, so I'm going to embed it just on top to displace, so I don't displace the ombre. But because the embed's white, obviously my dark color has to be on the top. I have stick blended this to a light trace. I have added my fragrance, which I am using Blackberry Fizz from Nature's Garden, which is a new to me, but it's supposed to be a slow mover, so I am praying that the description in the testing of theirs is accurate. Normally I wouldn't quite go on that. Usually I would test it, but I don't quite have, didn't have the time to do that beforehand. So anyways, I have just mixed the fragrance in by hand. I do not stick blend it. I try and not stick blend the fragrance at all, especially when I'm making an ombre, because I do not want it to speed up in any which way. Now, my batter split for this is about 70-30. I think it might be a little bit more like 68-32. But as I mentioned, you always want, I shouldn't say always, but 99% of the time, you want more of a light color, less of a dark color. And I am just going to start adding that in, mixing it, and slowly going back and forth, back and forth. It will be a lot of passes. You have to have patience, and you have to trust the process. Now, I do not measure exact amounts. I think a good ombre, partly, it's feel. Sometimes I will do 1 or 2 passes. Sometimes I'll do 3 passes. Sometimes even 4. Sometimes I'll add more color. Sometimes I will add less. It is a feel in many regards. You are pouring more into the mold than what I poured into this pitcher. If I poured equal amounts, I would be left over with whatever I started with in this pitcher. So you always want to pour a little bit more into the mold than what you actually poured into the cup with the color. If you find that you're moving too fast, like your base is getting really low and you still have a lot of color left, do just 1 pass maybe. It's just go down once, or maybe twice if you've been doing 3 times. You can slow it down, you can speed it up. If you find that you have too much of this color, say, and you're getting towards the end, add more to it. A little bit more is not going to kill your ombre and affect it, and you can still get a smooth ombre. That's one thing I have found, is that a lot of times I've seen it said that it needs to be equal amounts. And that you have to be very precise with adding the same amount of color each time. And yes and no. More often than not, for me, it's no. It depends on your color combo. It depends on how much a split you do. Like I said, for me, I find that more light, less dark is going to give me a better, smoother ombre, because the dark will overpower the light. And so if you have equal amounts, you're going to get a ombre that basically the very first part you get the ombre, and then the second part is going to just be all that solid dark color because you've had too much. You haven't been able to pour enough to get that nice subtle ombre throughout. So again, this is a good ombre is partly feel, partly patience. You need to do a lot of passes. That's how you're going to get that nice seamless ombre. And if you don't have the patience or the time to do that, then you're going to get an ombre that you can tell. Basically, you can see the seams between each pour, because the color transition is not going to be, you'll get a color transition, but it's not going to be subtle. So that's my advice to you, is trust the process, have patience, and do a lot of pours, like a lot of back and forths. It's just, you have to have that patience. You can see that I still have about half the color in here, and I'm getting lower than what I started with. When I started, the white was up to here, right? So I am steadily pouring more into the mold than I'm pouring into the cup. So that's kind of, I think, my biggest piece of advice to you. I do have my mold tilted. I'm going to get to a point soon where I'm going to lower it a little bit, and then again in the process I will lower it a little bit more. Basically once it starts to build up to the side, then I lower it. Now you can see this ombre it's starting to get more and more purple, and the purple is getting darker. So I am just going to speed this portion up a bit because I still have a lot to pour. And then we'll come back for the cut. Now I am going to be putting an embed in, and that embed is going to take up space, obviously. So what I've been doing off to the side is pouring a little bit. When I feel like I have extra of a color, I've just been pouring a little bit in there so that that embed will fit without overflowing. I have also been changing up whether I pour 2 or 3 passes, if you've noticed. Again, just depending on how the colors are coming out in the feel. Like, I know you're like, well, how do you learn feel? And part of it is just doing lots of ombres. I have done lots and lots of ombres. And it's just, I get a feel for how colors work. Different color combos are going to work differently. I'm going to do a triple ombre next, and the colors I'm doing are all similar. They are going to be aqua, teal, purple. So they're in that rainbow family, moving from one to the next. And that color ratio works a little bit different than if you're doing white. White, you're always going to need probably a 70-30 split if you're doing white in a color, in my opinion. Might not always be true, but generally I feel like that you do. When you're using black in a color, generally my 70-30 split rule still applies, but the 30 is not the black, which is the base color, like the white is the base color. I do 30% with the black and then the 70% with the color, because black is strong. And black is very hard to get the ombre to move. So I'm getting lower in my cup. I still have more in here. So I've been, again, pouring some off to the side. And just doing 2 passes right now, generally. So, but I'm getting closer. I don't know if I'll ever quite get to this dark, because I didn't pour off quite enough in the beginning. That's okay. The skate will still stand out, even if I don't go all the way to the purple. And you can see how the ombre is up on the side. Some of this, I don't know if you can see in here, I don't think you can. Some of this hasn't all evenly smoothed down. That's okay too. It might create a little pattern, but it will still work. So I'm going to lower this even more. And I said I was going to speed this up, but I ended up talking through this whole thing, basically. That wasn't quite my plan, but that's okay. So I'm gonna, again, pouring some off to the side. And that, again, the reason why I have some going off into this side mold over here is because I have this embed. It's about 8 ounces. So I'm just kind of like this little mold, I know how much it holds. And so I'm just making sure that I kind of remove 8 ounces all throughout the process. So when I put the embed in, it doesn't overflow. The mold, the soap doesn't overflow. And there you have it, our 2-color ombre. So we're gonna, I'm gonna put this to bed, and then tomorrow come back and we'll cut it. Okay, so can you see that subtle ombre? Oh, more so there. Purple's a hard color to do an ombre with white. I did more white than purple, and I kind of wish I had done a little less white, just from looking at the outside, but maybe once I cut it inside it will actually have the balance that I expect it to have. It's not awful. Putting the embed in did kind of displace things around, so it pulled the dark around it, which I expected. Probably not the best color choices. Like I said, you get more of just kind of that white, gray purple into the purple. But there's an ombre. One of the reasons I don't usually do purple is because you can see the seams. Even with lots and lots and lots of pouring, I can still make out kind of the transition. That's okay. I am overly critical of myself. I know that. So by any standards, this is a perfectly good ombre. But yeah, you know me. So that is a 2-color ombre. If I do white to 1 color, so if I'm just doing single colors, I like a really light pink. I've done red really well from white to red. I've done a dark green really well. I've done yellow, yellow gold, that whole family really well. Colors I have more trouble with going from white to the color purples, obviously. Grays, gray and black. It's just hard. It can be done, and it can be done well, but it's definitely hard. Blues, depending on your blue, can come out really nice, and sometimes it can come out, it's just harder to get that smooth gradient, in my opinion. Yellows can work really well too. They're light, and like it's just a light color anyways, and so when you're taking a white and a light color, they tend to just create a nice seamless 2-color ombre.